So while the slides are being loaded, when I was invited to come speak in this panel, my first question was, Kiev, December 2nd, what's the weather going to be like? And the answer I got was, Холодно и снежно. And I said, what does that mean? The answer I got, warm and sunny. That was my attempt to wake up my post-lunch crowd. My name is Mukesh Chulani. I am Registrar Services Senior Manager. I'm part of ICANN staff. And I work under the Global Domains Division. So within the Global Domains Division, George Sandowski earlier this morning mentioned 2 contracted parties with which ICANN works with. So the Global Domains Division actually oversees the relationships with those 2 contracted parties. Next slide, please, Eric. By the way, you will hear no more Russian from me over the course of the session. So I will not murder the language further. So this is a slide I want to start with just to set us all on the same level. And again, referring to what George mentioned earlier today. So this is the ecosystem with which the domain name servers, domain names are essentially sold, distributed. And I just want to set us all on the same ground on the difference between a registrar, a registry, a reseller, and a registrant. Because we don't have contracted relationships, contractual relationships with all of them. So we'll start on the extreme right of the slide. On the extreme right of the slide is a registrant. You'll see here a person who wants to register a GTLD domain name. They want to put up a website, so they see there are a couple of entities that offer domain names for sale. Then let's move one to the left. You'll see a reseller. That's the first entity that a registrant could obtain the domain from. There's no formal relationships between a reseller and ICANN. Move one box to the left, you'll see a registrar. And a registrar is also an entity that the registrant could obtain domains from. The difference is that they're subject to what is called the RAA, the Registrar Accreditation Agreement. So the reseller is subject to a contract between the registrar and the reseller, but nothing between the reseller and ICANN, just to make that clear. So oftentimes, and actually ideally, the registrant should not be able to know the difference because the reseller would perform exactly the same tasks, the same quality as a registrar. The only difference being the registrar is held to a contract with ICANN and thus has certain advantages. So the ICANN accreditation branding, they may use that. They may obtain special deals with registries, which a reseller would not be able to go through because they're one removed from the registry. So we'll move one box to the left again. Here you'll see a registry operator, service provider. The registry is essentially the wholesaler of the product, of the GTLD. And the registry operator signs what is called an RA, a registry agreement with ICANN. That's the other contract which they're party to. It's also important to note that between registrar and registry, they have their own agreement called the RRA, Registry Registrar Agreement. And ICANN is not a party to that. So the registrars need to sign that with any registries whose GTLDs they intend to sell. Next slide, please. So now that we've set us all on the same footing, just to give you a picture of registries and registrars around the globe. So in total, we have about 2,150 or so registrars and about 1,250 or so registries. So you'll have about 2,150 retailers, as you might think of them, and then 1,250 or so wholesalers, if you think of the registries in that manner. If you look at where the splits of these entities are located. So you'll see a concentration of registrars in the Americas. And you'll see, particularly interestingly, the ratio between registrars and registries are actually inverted for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. There's more registries than registrars in this region. Next slide, please. So when we look at registry operators across EMEA, there's about 400 or so of them, and they're spread across 30 countries. And you'll see here the largest representation. Again, I mentioned that registries in EMEA are actually very unique in that they outnumber the number of registrars. So Luxembourg has 60 registries, followed by Germany, the UK, Switzerland, France, Ireland, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at registrars. So there's about 200. One back, please. One slide back. Okay. So when you look at registrars, there's 40 countries wherein we have registrars across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And the largest representation comes from Germany, the UK, France, Netherlands, Spain. And if you look down the list, we're pleased to have, of course, 3 registrars accredited within Ukraine. And if you look across just Eastern Europe and the CIS zone, there's 21 accredited registrars. 9 in Russia, 3 in Ukraine, 2 in Lithuania, 2 in Bulgaria, and then 1 each in Belarus, Czech Republic, Hungary, Latvia, and Poland. So we've got quite a representation across the region. So how does ICANN serve these contracted parties? I ask you to move to the next slide. So this is the makeup of the registrar services and engagement team. So we have myself based in our Istanbul hub. We have Howard Lee, who covers Asia Pacific. And then we have in the US East Coast, Jennifer Gore, who is the director of the team, and Amy Bivens. And then in the US West Coast, in our Los Angeles hub, is Caitlin Tubergen. So this is the wider team that covers registrar services and engagement, of course with support of contractual compliance, legal, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. Now, when we take a look at the registry services and engagement team, because of the ramp up in new GTLDs, you'll see a lot more staffing within the registry services and engagement team, obviously. Within the Asia Pacific hub, you have Valerie. And then Istanbul has 2 staff, Ayşegül and Mert. In the US, you'll have Krista, who's the director of the team, Krista Papak, supported by the rest of her team, Dennis, Lisa, Lynette, Carla, Amanda, and Winnie. So there's 10 people supporting the registry services and engagement team across the world. Next slide, please. So what do we actually do? There's 15 people there. What do we actually do? The team essentially has dual roles to meet one goal. There's the role of the engagement manager. And the engagement manager is both proactive and reactive in this case. We attend all sorts of events such as these, and we also have webinars to spread information, to build personal relationships, to answer questions, to support, collaborate with both registrars and registry operators. And then there's the role of service manager. So there's a lot of transactional services like changing of primary contacts, et cetera, et cetera. There's managing a registrar or registry data escrow requirements. There's registrar accreditations. So there's a roster of services which the team would be able to perform across baskets, essentially. Next slide, please. So just to give you an example of what registry services and engagement team they cover. So they support registry operators. Each registry operator has an engagement manager. And this is the same with the registrar services team at ICANN. We all have assigned accounts with which we manage our relationships. We are their point of contact. We also act as advocates for those entities. If they have perspectives they want to share, we are their conduit to share that feedback to ICANN. We are involved in service design and launch. So we prepare service delivery documents, service design documents, sorry, to take a look at the various requirements of registry operators or registrars and how we can serve them better. We actually productize that, if I bastardize the word. We put together a plan on including the expected load, and then we proceed with actually delivering, launching that service internally. So some of the services from a registry side would include the contracting, the onboarding of a registry operator, rights protection mechanisms, and so on and so forth. From the registrar side, it might be something like the registrar data escrow process or the accreditation process. Also, there's a requirement to implement consensus policies, and both registry services and registrar services are called on to support this process. So we conduct outreach, we try to evaluate perspectives, develop a plan, and actually take part in implementation review teams. Next slide, please. So I'll just give you an example of the day in, a sample day in my life as a registry services and engagement team member. Just an example. I spend 6 hours a day drinking coffee, and then I go home. I'm joking. No. So what we have accreditations which we need to evaluate, for instance. So I've been in ICANN since January. So in less than a year, I've had roughly a dozen accreditation applications to review. And these are multiple review processes to evaluate their operational, their technical, their security, their contracting. Are they fit to the standard of being an ICANN accredited registrar? So we take part in that, the accreditation. There's registrar support. So I'll get a roster of phone calls or emails on a daily basis, asking our opinion, asking for support, asking questions on things like the transfer policy or some transactional requirements, some interest in joining registrar stakeholder groups, interest in participating in a IRT, interest in participating in a GSE-led event like this, comments, complaints. We are the conduit. So we are essentially the target for the first round of feedback. So we provide that type of support to registrars as well as they require. And then we do some efforts to provide advocacy. So if we don't do this, we would get flooded by questions. So proactively, we are conducting outreach. This is one example of that. Or I spent some sessions in Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa talking about accreditations. Just conducting outreach on what accreditations are like, what's the requirement, what's the expectation. At each ICANN meeting, I have a roster of meetings, one-on-one meetings with accredited registrars as a sounding board to find out what their issues are, what's their perspective of business, what's their perspective of policy, what's the effort required internally, just to understand it and then to actually provide that feedback internally. Policy implementation. So as I mentioned, there's, for instance, now there's the privacy proxy IRT, and there's also the address field validation IRT, which are going on. So these are sessions in which the registrar services team take part and move discussions along to actually develop policy. Then we have special projects. One of the projects which I'm leading internally is called the GTLD Marketplace Health Index. Essentially, ICANN wants to ensure that we can validate whether the GTLD marketplace is robust, Is it competitive? Is it stable? Is it trusted? So we're soliciting feedback from the community and working with an advisory panel to come up with metrics that can help answer these and show a representation of marketplace health. And we've produced our first beta report in July, and we're about to do that again before the end of the year. So just an example of the types of efforts which we are involved in within Registrar Services team. It's really just an overview discussion, and I'm here for the rest of the day. For any of you who have questions or just want to stop by and say hello, I'm happy to learn Russian, and I'm happy to speak with as many of you as possible. Thank you very much.